Welcome chess friends, today we're going to discuss a pawn landing that occurred in one of the games of Emily Plays Chess in the ALTO Charlotte 2020 tournament that took place last weekend. And one of the things in pawn landings is that you have to ask yourself, can I trade the pieces? So Emily was offering here the exchange of the rooks. So Emily is on the black side and she was playing Anatoly Umbetov with white. Emily is rated slightly above 1100 and her opponent was unrated, and this was the first round game. And the question is it good here to exchange the rooks? And that is what Emily was offering. And of course, the real question is, after a rook takes c8, king takes c8, can white allow themselves to play king g4, or is the breakthrough on the queen side with b6 and a5 too fast? And at first instance, when I was looking at this position, it feels like that that white is too slow with king g4, king takes g5, and then king f6 or king takes g6. And also, of course, after the king moves to f6, the king is outside the square of the black pawn on the a file. But it's very interesting, so let's have a look. After rook c8, king takes c8, in the game king e2 was played. So white said, I cannot allow myself to go pawn hunting. But let's have a look. King g4, b6, king takes g5, a5, b takes a5, b takes a5. So we see here the square of the pawn. We see that the white king is outside the square of the pawn. So it looks like it's a hopeless case. But what I really liked about this position, that it shows like a dual purpose move from white. Right, so before we go there, I would like to show two very easy ones, just to show the concept, and then of course a famous study in which this occurs. So let's go there, right? In this position, what is going on, right? The white king would like to take the pawn on h4, but black would like to change structure. So when we think about the key squares, the pawn on g2, these key squares are f4, g4 and h4. So if the king is able to take the pawn on h4, the white king is immediately on a key square and we know that the position is winning. But black will play h3 at the right moment and then try to get with the king to f7 or f8 to prevent the white king from getting to g7 or g8, which are the winning key squares for the rook pawn. So the dual purpose move here is king f5, bringing the king one step closer to the key squares g7, g8, and at the same time threatening king g4, followed by king takes h4 with a winning position. So if we go back here in this position, king f4 is a draw, and king f5 is the only way to win. Right, because black cannot allow white to take the pawn. So this is the last moment that black can push their pawn. And now we see that white occupies one of the key squares and is winning. So the same occurs in this situation. Right, king c7 going for the pawn on a7 is a draw. But white plays king c6, dual purpose move, shielding off the king on b4 and at the same time threatening king b7. And that is the only way to win the position here, because now, again, white occupies one of the key squares of the rook pawn and is winning. Now we go to the most famous study, of course, that you will be familiar with. This is the Rati study from 1921, so over 100 years ago. And it looks, of course, a hopeless situation. But the winning maneuver here for white, right, is that the king now is threatening to play king e7 and then supporting the promotion of the pawn. So black is forced to play king b6. After king e5, this threat is back again. And now after king e6, the white king is in the square of the pawn on h4, and it's a draw. So if we look at this position, it looks hopeless because the king is not even close to the pawn on h4, but by walking diagonally and having this dual purpose move, getting closer to the pawn on c6 and at the same time approaching the pawn on h4 and forcing black to play two moves with the black king, king b6, king takes e6. White is just in time to win the pawn on h4 or have their own pawn promote. So that's a dual purpose move. Let's go back to this position and where we were. So we were at this position. And we saw in the three examples that in all three examples it was of course a diagonal move with the king. So in this case we have a dual purpose move, king f6, right? And now the threat is, right, if white plays king d7, we step into the square of the pawn and we have a winning endgame because we have e4 and d5, two connected pawns defending each other, and white can just go and collect the a pawn. And after a4, now we see the other side of the dual purpose move, king e7, supporting the promotion, and white promotes or gains a tempo by checking on d7. And in this position white is winning because if you look at the queen and the king, they are much closer to the black pawns. So of course this requires still a lot of technique after queen d7, but the pawns are very weak. So I was surprised that if you look at this position, you would say after b6, right, here that the king is outside the square and it looks pretty hopeless and the king is too late. By having a dual purpose move, it was possible for white to win. So let's continue with the game, right? So here Emily played the excellent move a5 because a takes b5 loses, and we can see how that happens, right? Black tries to wait but to no avail, and now we get this, and using a side squeeze white gains the pawn on e5 and wins the game. And recently I learned that the term side squeeze in urban language is used for a second relationship, so I have to find another term for this maneuver. I always called it a side squeeze, to squeeze the opponent's king away from the pawns by approaching from the side. So excellent play by Emily, a5, and now we continue. Right, and now it's very curious, okay, let's continue, that black has one tempo, and that's actually what Emily is using. And here a draw was agreed. And look at this position, right? So of course the king of white has to go back, and white can take the pawn on b5. But at first glance you would say, okay, the black king has to defend against d6, d7, so cannot come forward. And the white king, although we have lost a pawn, can still defend against the a and the b pawn, right? By, for instance, having a setup when the pawns are on b4 and a3, the black pawns, by just shuffling a2, b3. So this seems at first instance like a draw. So I think this is a very interesting position. Let's look just at a few more moves, right? So if you are in this position and you would be on the black side, you can say now, okay, I think it's a draw. But practically speaking, let me just play a few more moves so I can better visualize what is possible. So the first thing we see here, right, is what are the squares that the black king can go to still remain in the square of the white pawn. Right? White cannot advance this pawn because the A and B pawn are defending each other, and so the king can be on A6, on B6, on C6 and C5, so it has quite some squares available to maneuver around. And so if white is waiting, right, black is able to use those squares to advance their pawns a bit. Right, and we can see here, right, the king is still in the square of the pawn. A4, right, and now you could say, now this is the maximum that black can get to in this situation, right? You could say without doing anything with the king. So king c5 is still possible, but now the pawns can no longer advance without the support of the king. So this was feasible if we go back here and say this is the square of the pawn. How far can I get? By just playing a few moves. We can advance our pawns, but at a certain moment they cannot advance any further without the support of the king. And now the question is, can black still win this position, right, by coming forward with the king? And can you find that? So I was surprised to find out, right? I mean, you can calculate it, and of course what I said is that you give a draw, but you could go to this position and then it becomes manageable to calculate and to verify whether it's possible to bring the king forward. So sometimes you just have to go as far as you can without risk, and then seeing if there's anything left in the position. So king b2, and here black, right, plays king b4, allows d6, checks, king goes to c1, now king c3, allows d7, a2, allows promotion, but black promotes with mate. So we saw this position, draw was agreed. It looks like here that black has to come forward with the king and cannot do that because the d pawn will promote. My practical advice would be is to continue to play this without risk until you reach a position where you can say, is there anything left? Is there a way to make this work? And we saw in this case, by using first this, being knowledgeable about the black king being in the square of the pawn, that we can get to this position without any risk, because we stay in the square of the pawn on d5. And then in this position after king c5, we should be able to calculate after king b2 that we can actually allow ourselves to play king b4, king c3, because we have a promotion with a check. We allow white to promote, but in the end we have a winning position because we promote with mate. Thank you for watching. I thought it was very interesting, and I hope you subscribe, and I'll see you again.